The morning in Malibu began the way it often did. Soft ocean breeze filtering through linen curtains, the faint scent of rosemary wafting from the garden below, and silence so curated it felt like part of the design. Meghan, or rather, Margot, Everly as the villa lease stated, moved slowly through the sunlit hallway, barefoot on cool tile, her silk robe brushing her ankles. She carried a half-filled mug of chamomile tea in one hand and her phone in the other, the screen aglow with another barrage of unanswered messages. She had barely slept the night before. Not for lack of trying, but because something had shifted. Not dramatically, not like an earthquake, but like the slow warping of wood under pressure. As ever, the audio project she had curated so carefully had begun to unravel at the seams. First, it was just one missed deadline. Then a key contributor quietly withdrew. Then her studio liaison started forwarding emails instead of answering them. By the time she reached her desk that morning, she had already decided it needed to stop. She didn't say it aloud. She didn't write it in any document. But the decision had already formed in the way she clicked open her laptop and stared at the untouched draft of the project's next script. She sat down, pulled the laptop closer, and deleted the first paragraph, then the second, and then closed it altogether. Down the hall, footsteps approached, measured, unhurried. Leo Thorne entered the room a moment later. He was tall, sharp-featured, dressed in one of his signature earth-toned linen suits that always looked like they'd been imported from a place no one could afford to visit. Leo had been her creative advisor for nearly 3 years. He wasn't just polished. He was precise. Where others hesitated, Leo always arrived with answers in tow. He placed a white folder on the glass desk without a word. Meghan glanced at it, but didn't reach. She already knew what was inside. It was the performance report for, as ever, listener metrics, platform feedback, internal notes from the board. But more than that, it was a mirror showing the project was not catching fire the way it had been predicted to. The listen-through rates were middling, the sponsors were anxious, the press cycle was lukewarm at best. She leaned back in her chair, fingers resting lightly on the armrest, and waited for Leo to speak. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he moved to the bar cart, poured himself a half glass of still water, and took a slow sip. Only then did he return to her side and point to a specific page in the report. And then he mentioned the delays. The postponements, the inconsistency in creative delivery. He used the phrase strategic timing adjustment, like it was a band-aid meant to soothe a bullet wound. Meghan nodded slightly. She understood what he wasn't saying. They both did. This was no longer just a creative decision. It was a public one. Later that afternoon, she sat alone by the pool, her tablet resting on her lap as she flipped through messages from her core production team. One of them had sent a voice note, clearly panicked, asking if the rumors were true. Another one had gone completely silent, someone she once considered a close friend. And then her phone buzzed with a name she didn't recognize. She answered. Anyway, on the line was an executive from the studio, someone new, someone young, with an overconfident voice. He began speaking without introduction, his tone sharp but disguised in corporate politeness. And then he referred to her show, the one she had poured herself into, as emotionally indulgent. She didn't respond. She let the silence expand. And then he continued, trying to reframe the pause as a much-needed break to recalibrate. Brand alignment. She ended the call without comment and dropped the phone beside her. Her heart wasn't racing. It was steady. But there was something else. An ache, not of failure, but of betrayal. By early evening, the press had caught wind of the pause. It was unclear how. Probably a leak from the internal meeting held at Palisade Entertainment that morning. The headlines were not aggressive, but they were condescending. Meghan's podcast project on hold as Duchess rethinks creative direction. The phrasing stung, as if she were flailing, as if this hadn't been intentional, And then Harry walked into the room. He had just returned from an event downtown. She noticed he had taken off his jacket but kept the rest of his suit on, something he only did when he knew the day wasn't over yet. He didn't ask how she was. He didn't need to. He saw the silence wrapped around her shoulders like armor. He sat next to her and placed a hand on her knee, and then she told him everything. Slowly. Fact by fact. Not as a plea, but as a confirmation. She told him about Leo's concerns, about the studio's new attitude, about the subtle ways people had begun pulling away. And then he asked if she wanted to walk away entirely. She looked at him for a long time, and then she shook her head. No, she didn't want to quit. But she wanted it to stop, for now, not forever. Not because it failed, but because it needed to change, because she needed to breathe again without shaping her exhale into a quote. Later, that night, she sat by herself in her writing room. No music, no lights other than the soft glow from her desk lamp. She opened a new document, not titled, not dated, just blank. And then she wrote 5 words. This is not the end. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply pressed save, and the pause began. Miles Beckett did not believe in disruption. He believed in orchestration. Every decision, every call, every shift in tone, it all had to fit within a calculated system. So when Meghan's As Ever project was first presented during a high-level development meeting at Palisade Entertainment, he remained quiet. He sat at the far end of the table, flipping through the proposal with the detached precision of a man trained not to react. The concept was too soft, he thought. Too sincere. It lacked the metrics he preferred: virality, monetization paths, celebrity leverage. But it was greenlit regardless, largely due to Meghan's name, and so he waited. He didn't interfere at first. Instead, he observed. He listened during calls. He sat in on Zoom briefings, camera off. He studied the editorial structure, memoir-driven, audio stories stitched together with reflective narration. It was personal, too personal. Not the kind of content that sold with advertisers who needed concrete guarantees and tidy demographic breakdowns. He knew that eventually the numbers would speak louder than the name. And then they did. The data came in slow. Listener numbers were fair, but stagnant. The average completion rate for each episode was lower than projected. More troubling, the core audience skewed far older than expected. Sponsors flagged concern. The press coverage turned cautious. And then the whispers started. That's when Miles made his first move. He didn't cancel anything. That would be too obvious, too premature. Instead, he made suggestions. Innocent ones. He sent emails recommending format adjustments. Asked for more structure, less drift. Requested an executive summary of upcoming themes, then delayed his approvals by a few days. And then he offered to introduce a branding consultant, a former colleague who specialized in resonance realignment. That consultant, of course, had a track record of neutering original concepts into diluted commercial bundles. And then Meghan pushed back. She didn't accept the consultant. She didn't respond to his formatting notes. Instead, she quietly moved some of her production in-house, forming a micro-team around her. She became selective with correspondence, began leaning more heavily on Leo Thorne, and limited studio calls to bi-weekly. Miles noticed the shift and smiled. Distance meant opportunity. He knew how to operate in the vacuum, and then he began planting seeds. In the next internal meeting, he adjusted his tone subtly. When another executive asked about the podcast's mid-season arc, Miles replied that the project was ambitiously personal but structurally experimental. He used words like unpredictable and evolving, both of which sounded complimentary but carried hidden doubts when repeated in the right rooms. And then he mentioned sponsorship risks. Not accusations, just observations. One of their banking partners had hesitated to renew. One of their fashion brands had shifted its support toward a true crime audio docuseries instead. He placed the data on the table like chess pieces, letting others draw the conclusions he had already shaped. Outside of boardrooms, he made subtler moves. He asked the PR team to pull back on scheduled press pushes, suggested that their next email blast focus on a different, more broad-reaching project. Behind the scenes, he spoke to 3 freelance writers and asked them for opinion pieces on the broader challenges of celebrity-led podcasts. He didn't request hit pieces, just critical thought. He provided data. They followed the scent. And then the first article dropped. It appeared in an indie media blog. The title was understated, "When Royal Storytelling Meets Public Fatigue." It didn't mention "as ever" by name until the 4th paragraph. But the implication was clear. Meghan's pivot to personal, audio content was framed as another attempt to reclaim relevance. It questioned the authenticity of the project's emotional tone. It ended with a vague but biting line. "Maybe not every story needs to be told by a princess." Miles shared the article internally with a short note, "for awareness." He didn't comment further, and then Meghan issued the pause statement. Miles was copied on the internal distribution list. He read the statement twice. It was calm, controlled. It framed the halt as a strategic recalibration to serve the audience better. No drama, no specifics. But he noticed something else. There was no direct mention of Palisade Entertainment in the statement. That omission rang louder than the words themselves, and then she went quiet. No new meetings, no calls. The studio inbox received an auto-reply. Her team stopped submitting edits. For 2 weeks, the project simply vanished from internal chatter. A junior staffer even asked if the show had been canceled. Miles didn't say yes. He just nodded and said the studio was exploring creative alternatives. And then, without warning, her name returned. Not on studio spreadsheets, not in pitch decks, but in a whisper, through someone Miles didn't know. Devon Vance had never passed through Palisade's halls. He wasn't a familiar name. But when Miles read a blind item, tweet referencing a radical new voice being courted by a duchess in exile, he began pulling files. Devon was known in underground podcast circuits, sharp, socially charged, unapologetically narrative-driven. He didn't operate with suits, he didn't chase validation, and most importantly, he didn't need Miles Beckett. That made him dangerous. Miles picked up the phone and called his colleague in distribution. He asked if they had any knowledge of Meghan working on a reboot. They didn't. He called his contact in press. No confirmed updates, but a journalist from The Atlantic had recently reached out for background on Meghan's prior audio partnerships. And then he leaned back in his chair. For the first time in months, he felt off balance, not threatened, but excluded. He knew she was working again. He could feel it. The silence was not retreat. It was recalibration. But this time, he wasn't part of it. And then he made a final call. He dialed Leo Thorne's number twice. No answer. On the 3rd attempt, he left a voicemail, polite but pointed, requesting a brief touch base regarding future collaborations. He never received a reply. And then he did something rare. He stopped moving, not because he didn't have options, but because he realized the board wouldn't approve another push. Not without results, not without leverage. And right now Meghan had outmaneuvered him, not with noise but with withdrawal. So he waited, and he listened. But in the distance, a new project was already beginning to breathe. The English morning air hit Henry's face with a sharpness he had nearly forgotten. It was colder than California, less forgiving, but familiar in a way that made him feel like a different version of himself. Not the man who attended charity galas with rehearsed smiles, not the father balancing diaper changes with documentary pitches, but the man who used to walk this city with purpose, certainty, and legacy stitched into every footstep. London hadn't changed. but he had. He didn't alert the press. He didn't notify the palace. He arrived through a discreet terminal at Heathrow, bags handled by a trusted assistant from his Invictus circle. The official reason for the trip was straightforward: a veterans board meeting in Chelsea, scheduled 3 months prior. The real reason sat much deeper beneath the surface. He had seen what was happening. He had read the headlines. He had watched the narrative harden around Meghan's silence. And then he did something he rarely allowed himself to do anymore. He scrolled through the comments. They were vicious, cold, punctuated with ridicule. They called her weak, overrated, manipulative. They mocked the pause of her project as a sign of creative collapse. A few even floated the old rumors again, ones about her mental health, her marriage, her worth. And Henry, no matter how thick his skin had become, felt his jaw clench with a familiar ache. He had been distant from the project on purpose. Meghan had insisted on handling it alone, and he had respected that. But now it had become personal. The meeting in Chelsea was efficient. The agenda focused on funding goals and event partnerships. Henry contributed where necessary, nodded at the right times, shook hands with old friends and silent enemies. And then, once the formalities ended, he excused himself quietly and took a car into central London. He arrived at a pub in Chelsea, not far from where his late mother used to bring him as a child. Inside, the lighting was dim, the ceilings low, and the crowd sparse. At a small table near the back, a man sat nursing a pint and reading a battered newspaper. Tom Wexley hadn't changed much. His hair had thinned, and his suit was more rumpled than usual, but the sharpness in his eyes remained. Once one of the more principled voices in British media, Tom had walked away from royal reporting after a story he submitted, one that defended Meghan's charitable work, was heavily edited without his permission. Henry approached without hesitation and took the seat across from him, and then he laid it all out. He explained the pressures Meghan had faced, not just from the press but from internal forces that wanted her project to follow a formula she rejected. He explained how the pause wasn't a breakdown, but a calculated breath. And then he spoke about the culture of suspicion, how every move Meghan made was reframed through a lens of skepticism that none of his royal cousins had to endure. Tom listened without interruption. He tapped his fingers lightly on the table and then asked only one question: what could be done? Henry didn't have a perfect answer, but he knew what he could do, and then he did something unexpected. He re-entered the public square, not as a husband defending a wife, but as a prince advocating for creative sovereignty. Over the next 2 weeks, Henry began accepting invitations, carefully chosen ones, not tabloids, not mainstream talk shows. Instead, he appeared on podcasts hosted by veterans, mental health advocates, and independent journalists. Each appearance was intentional. He talked about resilience, about transition. And when the moment was right, he mentioned Meghan, not by title, not with fanfare. He referred to her as someone building new ways to tell stories that don't fit traditional molds. He mentioned the weight of expectation, the courage it takes to start something original and pause it, not out of failure, but out of vision. And then something shifted. Small outlets began to reframe the narrative. A few writers took notice. One op-ed referred to the pause as a sign of artistic control rather than collapse. Another pointed out the double standards women, especially women of color, face when they step outside of pre-approved formats. Henry read each one carefully. He didn't share them. He didn't gloat. But he felt the temperature change, not dramatically, but subtly, a degree warmer, a touch more fair. Back in California, Meghan noticed too. Leo had forwarded her one of the pieces with a simple note. "He's moving the board." She didn't respond, but she sat with that line for a long time, and then she picked up her phone. She didn't call Henry. Not yet. She called Devon Vance. The two had spoken only once, weeks earlier, when Devon had quietly expressed interest in contributing to a future project. At the time, she hadn't been ready. But now, with Henry lighting, fires across the ocean, and the old narrative beginning to crack, she felt it was time. Devon answered on the second ring. And then she asked him a single question. What would a rebirth look like? Devon didn't offer a proposal. He asked for her to send him 5 minutes of voice notes, unedited, unplanned. Just her voice in a room, saying what she wanted the world to feel. No script. No outline, and then he'd build from that. Meghan ended the call and stared at her phone, and then she began to record. The first few sentences came out awkward, disjointed, but soon her voice found rhythm. She spoke not as a duchess, not as a former actress, not even as a wife. She spoke as a woman who had watched the world try to edit her into silence, and chose instead to pause, rebuild, and speak again. The next morning, Devon sent back a sample. It was raw, powerful, unfiltered. He had layered her voice with subtle music and added short voiceovers from other women, immigrants, artists, caregivers. It wasn't as ever. It was something else, something braver. And then she smiled. Not because it was perfect, but because it was hers. Later that week, as Henry flew back from London, she met him at the airport with no cameras in sight. She walked up to him in a plain coat, no makeup, her hair pulled back into a low knot. He pulled his luggage behind him and dropped it when he saw her. And then she hugged him without a word. They didn't speak until the drive home. And when they did, she told him everything. About Devon, about the new voice, about what was coming. He listened, and then he reached for her hand and squeezed it once. Not in triumph, but in solidarity. Because they both knew this wasn't about one podcast anymore. It was about refusing to be written out of their own story. The ice. Sun rose slower in Montecito that week, or maybe it only felt that way because the house was finally quiet. Not silent, but calm. The kind of calm that came after a storm had passed, when everything was still damp with memory, but intact. Meghan stood barefoot in the kitchen, slicing fruit for Archie's breakfast, while the kettle hissed gently behind her. The phone lay, face down on the marble counter. No alerts, no missed calls. No studio messages demanding rewrites or brand synergy. And then she walked away from it. In the small writing room off the courtyard, Devon Vance waited with headphones around his neck and a half-open laptop in front of him. The new audio series, still, untitled, had entered its earliest phase, but already it felt different. It wasn't designed for mass appeal. It wasn't built in boardrooms or crafted around demographic data. It was real, raw, unapologetic. Meghan entered the room with a notepad, not a script. She didn't sit behind a desk. She sat cross-legged on the floor, and then they began. Devon played a few segments they'd been working on, voice notes from a single mother in Chicago, an Afghan refugee telling her story in fragments of memory, a retired nurse who'd lost everything in a hospital closure. Over it all, Meghan's narration wove in and out, no longer polished or perfect. Her voice cracked sometimes. She laughed mid-sentence. She paused for breath. There was no studio, polish, no filters. And then Leo Thorne entered the room, a steaming mug in one hand and a skeptical eyebrow raised. He had watched this transformation cautiously, unsure if it was a comeback or a collapse. But today, when he listened to the draft and saw Meghan's face, focused, steady, unbothered, he understood. She wasn't trying to rebuild as ever. She was building something newer, something truer. And then the name came, not from a meeting or a brainstorm, but from a sentence Meghan muttered while reviewing her own voice notes. People just want to feel heard as they are. Devon repeated it aloud and shortened it. As they are. They looked at each other, and then they nodded. The project had found its spine. Meanwhile, back at Palisade Entertainment, Miles Beckett sat in a sleek glass office, reviewing pitch decks for 3 upcoming shows. None of them had Meghan's name on them. None of them had her reach, her narrative weight, or her controversy. He had requested a private update from one of his remaining contacts on Meghan's team. The reply was brief: "She's moved on, and we're not looped in." And then he closed the email. He wasn't angry. He didn't even feel betrayed. What he felt was something closer to irritation, a slow burn of realizing that while he had been managing optics, she had been rebuilding structure. He had mistaken her silence for surrender. That miscalculation would cost him. Not in headlines, not in public failure, but in relevance. And then the ripple began. The teaser for As They Are dropped on a Tuesday morning. No announcement. No promotion. Just a single waveform post on Meghan's personal blog, accompanied by one sentence. A new chapter, spoken, not shaped. It spread faster than expected. Not because of press, but because of people. Listeners who had followed her journey from the beginning shared it with quiet admiration. Critics expected another overproduced royal memoir. What they got instead was a single 5-minute audio clip, her voice over the sound of children playing, of streetcars, of whispered phone calls from strangers. No theme music, no brand mention, just presence. And then Harry reposted it, not through his formal channels, but through a small Instagram account tied to the Invictus Foundation. He captioned it with one line: "Real voices don't need filters, Media scrambled. Was this the reboot of As Ever? Was this a response to studio fallout? Was it a statement? A comeback? Meghan didn't answer. She let the clip speak. Behind the scenes, her home began to change. The writing room became a semi-permanent studio. Microphones were installed beneath lampshades to keep the space from feeling cold. Archie's coloring books remained in the corner. The team expanded, not with executives, but with contributors. 2 young interns joined, both from underrepresented journalism schools. One assistant was brought on who specialized in soundscaping real-life environments, marketplaces, beaches, alleyways. And then they built episode 1. It wasn't about Meghan. It was about a woman named Farah who had left her country during a war and arrived in the U.S. with 2 children and 1 suitcase. Meghan only spoke for 30 seconds in the entire episode. The rest was Farah. And then the messages came in. Thousands. Not through corporate accounts, but through direct channels, emails, voice notes, handwritten letters mailed to a P.O. box in Los Angeles. Women, men, teenagers, nurses, veterans, each of them saying the same thing. I heard myself in her. Not her, as in Meghan, but her as in Farah, as in the next guest, as in the idea that someone else's story could feel like your own. And then Meghan cried, not publicly, not performatively, but quietly, on the studio floor, knees to chest, Leo on one side and Devon on the other. She cried not because of pain, but because after all the noise, all the reduction, all the rewrites of her public self, she had finally spoken without echo, and people had listened. By the end of the month, 3 more episodes had been completed. None of them followed a strict release schedule. There were no marketing deadlines, no mandatory sponsor breaks. Each episode was allowed to breathe. Meanwhile, Miles Beckett shifted his attention. Palisade launched a new series with a mid-tier, Celebrity. It failed to hit metrics. The board asked questions. He deflected, but he knew. He knew that something had moved in the ecosystem, something that didn't play by the old rules, and then he saw it. A podcast ranking site had quietly placed, As They Are in its top 20, under social impact, next to long-running legacy shows. It had no paid ads, no launch campaign. It had just arrived, and then it stayed. That evening, Meghan stood on her balcony, a warm wind pulling at her sleeves. Henry joined her, holding 2 mugs, hers with peppermint, his with espresso. They looked out at the dusk together, and then she turned to him and smiled. Not the smile for cameras, not the smile for interviews. The one that meant she was exactly where she needed to be, not at the center of attention, but at the edge of something real. And then they went inside, and the work continued.